Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's episode, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Ukrainian proxy forces. Now, what I first want to do is obviously you can see the map, you can see the location of the map. We're kind of centered on the area of operations near Pokrovsk. Now, if you go to a recent article by the Kiev Independent, now this is coming from the Ukraine side of the conflict. Field report. After holding firm against enemy attacks for the better part of a year, one of the Ukraine's greatest fortress cities, Pokrovsk, is at risk of being cut off by recent Russian advances. Now, the reality on the ground is that in terms of being able to supply the city with military equipment, food, and the ammunition needed to continue to fight in this sector, the city has been cut off. It is incredibly difficult for Ukrainian forces to utilize the E50 highway or this highway to the to the northeast of the city as well. We have received a variety of reports about the condition of the ability of the Ukrainian supply apparatus to relieve and or supply Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk. These operations are still taking place, but they are being done on an individual vehicle basis. If any more than a platoon-sized element of vehicles disguised in civilian trucks and cars and personally owned vehicles make attempts to enter the city, the town, it is immediately attacked by Russian drone operators. And it's just not, obviously, the small FPV drones that are being used. It is the ability of Russian long, medium range, and short range artillery systems that have the ability via drone observation to immediately attack any Ukrainian forces attempting to supply Pokrovsk. The city is essentially under siege. If we go back over to the deep state map and we look at the distance from just behind the front line to some of these major arterial routes into Pokrovsk, 7.2 kilometers. Well within the range of essentially any weapon system, any indirect fire weapon system that Russian forces maintain in this area. If we go over to the northeastern quadrant of operations, again, under 10 kilometers. So again, Russian field artillery, drones have overlapping sectors of fire on any Ukrainian forces that try to get into Pokrovsk, either through the use of vehicles, motorcycles, on foot. It really doesn't matter. It's a very, very difficult situation for the Ukrainian military to supply those forces in this area. Now, we continue to hear about the use of Russian drone strikes happening really all over the Ukraine in terms of targeting various areas inside of the Ukraine. Now, what's interesting is that the Ukrainian, the NATO side acknowledge very few casualties, right? The perception is that the Russians have initiated an open bombing campaign against cities and towns inside of the Ukraine. Now that is what is being discussed and talked about by the mainstream media. The problem with that is the casualty reports. The casualty reports that are being reported by the Ukrainians and NATO in terms of these Russian strikes. Again, you're looking at, in some cases, 500 aim points being hit in one day. And then you hear that 2 to 3 Ukrainian civilians were killed. That is not indicative of an all-out bombing campaign to target civilians. If that was the case, and the Russians were hitting 500 aim points per day and targeting civilians, you would have hundreds of Ukrainian civilians being killed and wounded per day. But even the Ukrainians don't even report that. So that's not what is happening. The Russians are being very selective in the targets they're going after. They're going after Western supply capacity, weapons depots, training areas that are designed to reinforce the Ukrainian military. The Russian military, as we speak right now, and conducting these massive strikes day in and day out, are not targeting the Ukrainian civilian population. Otherwise, you would see a lot more casualties. So that's not taking place. The only time you see civilian casualties is when the Russians are going after targets in which the Ukrainians place these NATO weapon systems near civilian targets. And hence that causes collateral damage. Now look, if you have a weapon system and you place that weapon system in a town, the Russians are going to target it. Now they will probably use reason. They will probably try to be as responsible as they can. And how do we know this? How do we know that the Russians are looking very closely at what targets they're going after? Again, you have to look at the casualty levels. The casualty levels in terms of civilian casualties in this conflict are not very large. Not when you compare and contrast casualty levels that have taken place in other conflicts. Right? Look at some of the conflicts that are taking place right now in the Middle East and some of the casualty levels. A lot higher. A lot higher. And at the same time, if the Russians have made that decision to obliterate a town or a city, they could certainly do that. And they could increase that civilian casualty level up to thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. But they're not doing that. And that is why you're hearing this almost duality where the West is claiming that the Russians are targeting civilian infrastructure, civilians, but the casualties listed in these strikes are very small. And again, it's because the Russians are attempting to limit the casualties of the Ukrainian civilian population. I imagine because the Russians believe that eventually they will be governing this part of the population. So they don't want a hostile population that was bombed into submission. But again, the strategy right now by the Russians is not to bomb the Russian-speaking population into submission. That's not what is happening. The town, for instance, this self-announced city of Pokrovsk has not been rubbleized. I mean, yes, buildings have been reduced, buildings have been destroyed, targets have been hit inside the city, but the town has not been rubbleized. It does not look like a city on the outskirts of Damascus in Syria. Doesn't look like that. And why doesn't it look like that? Russians have more capability than the Syrian army in terms of capability to rubbleize and destroy a city, a town. Can do it in hours with its Air Force, indirect fire systems. But these towns don't look like what you would see inside of Syria, depending on the town you're looking at. Why? Because the Russians are using discretion in terms of what they're targeting and how they're targeting it. Right now, again, yes, it's the siege of Pokrovsk, and they're preventing the reinforcing of Pokrovsk, and at the same time, they're continuing to make localized tactical advances towards the city. And eventually, Pokrovsk will fall. It will become enveloped. It's an untenable situation for the Ukrainians, and it will fall. And then eventually, you will probably see a push west of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk with the main Russian effort to partially encircle, besiege Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, and seek the capitulation of those cities as well. But again, we're continuing to see just the massive use of drones, guided glide bombs, the use of air power, long range, multiple launch rocket systems to precisely target Ukrainian military formations, and then conduct deep battle doctrine against the Ukrainian military apparatus, its ability to feed, supply, train, recruit, and provide additional forces to the conflict. And that's what the Russians are doing, and that's what the Russians will continue to do in this conflict. And right now, as we watch the political situation, or the lack of the political situation, both sides have essentially committed themselves to a military solution to this conflict. There does not appear to be any political solution on the table until one side's military completely collapses. And again, if you look at the challenges that the Ukrainian military are having right now, if you look at the production levels of the Russian military, just within the last 24 hours, the head of the Italian military has come out and openly stated that the Russian military is vastly outproducing the NATO military industrial capacity to supply and support Ukrainian forces. Check it out yourself. That's what was said, and that's what is happening. The Russians have converted large sectors of its civilian economy, of its civil industry, towards military production. We haven't seen the general mobilization yet inside of Russia. That has not taken place, and we probably won't see that unless there's an all-out war between NATO and the Russian Federation. But in terms of producing weapon systems, tanks, drones, aircraft, the Russians are certainly mobilizing its economy to produce said systems, and they're outproducing their NATO counterparts in a pretty significant way right now. And again, at the same time, you see what's happening with the Ukrainian military. You look at as I've talked about before, look at the average age of a Ukrainian soldier. It's vastly older than their Russian counterpart. Again, you're looking at soldiers in the Ukrainian military, frontline soldiers right now, infantry units that are made up largely of personnel in their 40s, in some cases 50, 60 years old, very, very elderly personnel inside the Ukrainian the military. And you have to say at this point, the Ukraine is essentially scraping the barrel. Gone are the days where the Ukraine is seeing large amounts of young volunteers joining the military. You're not seeing that anymore. It's actually just the opposite. You're seeing large amounts of young Ukrainian males trying to get out of the Ukraine, and they're fleeing to the West. And that leaves, in terms of the Ukrainian recruitment policy, going after these older males and inducting them into military service. And you are seeing, in terms of the morale or the lack of morale in the Ukrainian military, what is happening on the battlefield, and it's going to continue. But again, it has been a few days since we have last posted. Again, as always, thanks for joining us. More to come relatively soon. Have a good day.